Okay, so today we're diving into something pretty familiar, something you do like every single day, multiple times a day.
Right.
We're talking about flavor, but not just like sweet, sour, salty, we're going way deeper than that, right? We're going to talk about taste, of course, but also smell, and even like the fizz you feel from soda or the heat from a hot pepper.
Oh, yeah.
So it's really about how your brain puts together this like complete sensory image of everything you eat.
Yeah, it really is like a whole sensory image. It's not just one thing. It's like this full experience.
And that image really ends up like driving your decisions about food,
Totally.
It determines what you crave, what you end up like grabbing out of the fridge and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, when you really think about it, it's kind of wild how this thing that you can't even really see has so much power over what we eat.
Absolutely. So we've talked about this a bit before on the show, but
Yeah.
today we're really going in depth. Okay. We want to get into like the nitty-gritty details of how those flavor compounds actually get released from your food, like while you're eating. All that chewing and swallowing, all that physical stuff. That's really where the magic happens, right?
Oh, sure. The stuff we're looking at today really gets into the mechanics of all that. It builds on what we've talked about before.
Okay.
And it shows how your mouth is like way more than just a passive receiver of food. It's really like an active participant in unlocking those flavors.
I like that, an active participant.
Yeah, and the way you actually physically interact with your food, like how you chew and all that, has a huge impact on what you end up tasting and smelling.
So it's not just what's in the food, it's also how you eat it.
Exactly.
That's really interesting. And another thing that's interesting is just the sheer number of these flavor molecules.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, we're talking about alcohols and acids, like that tartness in citrus fruits.
Right.
And then there's esters, which are often behind those like fruity, sweet flavors. And then you've got phenolic compounds. It's like this whole secret language happening in every bite.
It really is. And look, that each of these like groups of compounds brings its own unique set of flavors to the table. It's not just one note, it's a whole orchestra.
I love that analogy. So like, give me an example. There's like a specific compound that we can like point to and say, okay, this is what makes this thing taste this way.
Yeah, totally. So the material mentions these C6 alcohols, like cis-3-hexanol and cis-6-hexanol, and these are formed when enzymes in plants break down fats. And guess what you get?
I don't know what you get.
That actually cut grass smell.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So it's not just like some general planty smell, it's these specific compounds being released.
Exactly.
That's so cool. And then what about, they mentioned terpene alcohols too. Things like linalool, geraniol, those sound a lot fancier.
Yeah. Those are often the stars of the show in fruits and flowers. They give those really nice fruity and floral aromas. Like think about muscat grapes. Those have a really strong perfumey aroma.
They do.
And a lot of that comes from the terpene alcohols.
Wow.
And then you've got phenylethanol, which gives you that classic rose scent. And what's also interesting is that these alcohols can actually act as precursors for other flavor compounds to form. It's like a chain reaction.
So you start with one, and it can lead to a whole cascade of other flavors.
Exactly.
That's amazing. Okay, so now we're moving on to something that I find really counterintuitive.
Okay.
We usually think that big molecules don't have a taste, right?
Right.
Like you can't taste a protein. But apparently there are these like rogue proteins that actually trigger an intense sweet taste.
Yeah. There are really interesting examples in the material. One is thaumatin, which comes from an African plant.
Okay.
And get this, it's something like 1,600 times sweeter than table sugar, and it's actually approved as a sweetener.
Wow. 1,600 times sweeter than sugar. That's incredible.
All right. And then there's brazine, which is another protein. It's even smaller than thaumatin, and it's about 2,000 times sweeter than sugar. But the interesting thing about brazine is that it supposedly tastes even more like sugar than thaumatin does.
So it's like super sweet, but also tastes like sugar.
Yeah, it's like sugar on steroid.
Wow, that's just mind-blowing. It really makes you rethink what taste even means.
It really does.
Okay, we've got all these incredible flavor compounds just waiting to be unleashed in our food.
Right.
But now we have to eat the food.
Yes.
So how do our body mechanics like actually affect what flavors we end up experiencing?
Well, one of the most important things is your breathing. When you breathe faster, you're actually pulling more of those volatile aroma compounds up into your nose.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and that means more of them end up in the air. you exhale, where your smell receptors can pick them up.
So you're almost like vacuuming up those flavors by breathing faster.
Exactly. And then there's chewing. All that muscle action breaks down the food into smaller pieces. And when you have smaller pieces, you have more surface area.
Right.
And more surface area means more aroma compounds can escape and become airborne.
So it's not just about the taste buds on your tongue. It's also about how you chew and breathe.
Exactly. It's like you're aerating the flavors.
That's a great way to put it. So it's not just the physical act of eating, though, right?
Yeah.
Our own internal state also plays a role.
Oh, absolutely. Physiological factors are important. The material specifically talks about how your masticatory behavior, basically how you chew, has a big impact.
Okay.
And then you also have the properties of the bolus itself.
The bolus.
Yeah, that's just the scientific term for the chewed up food.
Okay.
And things like how it flows in your mouth,
Yeah.
how easily it spreads, how much it mixes with saliva. All of those things can influence how long aroma compounds stick around and when they're released.
So like a really firm apple versus a mushy apple is going to have a different flavor experience just because of how it interacts with our mouth.
Exactly. And the material even talks about how firmer cheeses release their aromas differently compared to softer cheeses.
Okay.
And then there's your saliva,
Oh, yeah.
that unsung hero of flavor. It turns out that the composition of your saliva, especially the amount of salivary proteins, can actually affect aroma release.
Really?
Yeah, so more of these proteins can actually bind to flavor compounds, meaning fewer of them make it to your smell receptors.
So even my own spit can change how I taste things.
Basically, yeah.
That's amazing. I had no idea. Okay. So this is all starting to sound really complicated. How do researchers even begin to study all of this?
It's definitely a challenge. One of the things Ariel points out is that surprisingly few studies actually look at the simultaneous release of aroma and taste compounds.
You don't?
No, they often study them in isolation. But to really understand the full flavor experience, you have to consider how they interact.
Right, because it's not like they're happening separately in your mouth. It's all happening at the same time.
Exactly. And the material talks about one study that took a more holistic approach. They wanted to see how the composition of model cheeses, specifically the ratio of fat to protein, and the amount of salt affected things like the release of sodium, the release of aroma, and how people perceived the overall flavor.
Model cheeses, what are those, like fake cheese?
They're not fake cheese exactly, they're just simplified versions that are made in the lab, so it's a way to control the ingredients really precisely and see how they affect the flavor.
Oh, that's smart. Okay, so what did they find when they studied these model cheeses?
Well, one of the main things they found was that the fat-protein ratio had a big impact. So cheeses with a higher protein content tended to be harder and more elastic.
Okay.
And cheeses with more fat were described as fatty, smooth, sticky, and they also had a stronger buttery aroma.
That makes sense. The fat kind of adds to that richness and the buttery smell.
Exactly. And then they also looked at the salt content, and not surprisingly, the salt content mainly increased the perceived saltiness. But what was interesting is that it also led to a higher release of sodium in the saliva after chewing.
Really?
Yeah. And even more surprisingly, the overall intensity of the aroma was correlated with the perceived saltiness.
So like the saltier was, the stronger the aroma?
Exactly. And the researchers think this might be because our senses of taste and smell can actually influence each other.
Right.
Especially when the sensations kind of match up, like, you know, a savory aroma and a salty taste.
So the salt is almost like a volume knob for the aroma.
That's a great way to put it.
And what about the buttery notes you mentioned earlier? Were those stronger in the cheeses with more fat?
Yes, definitely. And this was also linked to the sensation of fattiness in the mouth. So it seems like the fat content not only contributes to the aroma, but also to the texture and the overall mouthfeel.
It all ties together.
It really does.
So it all comes back to this idea that flavor is this really integrated sensory experience.
Yeah.
It's not just these isolated tastes and smells happening independently. It's this constant interaction between all of them.
It's a symphony of senses.
I like that. And it's a symphony that's constantly changing too, right?
Absolutely.
It depends on things like how quickly you're breathing, how thoroughly you're chewing each bite, even the composition of your saliva at that moment.
All of those things can affect how you experience the flavors.
That's wild. It really makes you wonder about how your own eating habits might be shaping your flavor experiences without you even realizing it.
It really does. You know, we do so many things unconsciously when we eat.
That's true. And so if these seemingly small things like chewing and breathing can have such a big impact on flavor, it makes you wonder what other unconscious bodily processes might be influencing our sensory world and our food preferences in ways we don't even realize.
Right. It's like there's this whole hidden dimension to how we experience food.
Exactly. Well, this has definitely been a really thought-provoking deep dive into the world of flavor.
It has.
Thanks for exploring this with me.
My pleasure.
It's given me a lot to chew on,
Good one.
both literally and figuratively.
I see what you did there.
All right. Thanks again for joining.
Anytime.